Good morning, everyone. I'm Metagross Freak, taking a look today at Transformers Power of the Primes, Voyager class Inferno. Now, if you aren't as familiar with the character of Inferno, that is perfectly fine. Inferno is kind of one of the B or C list members of the Autobots. He is a firefighter, and in case you recognize this particular body type, Inferno is actually a remold slash repaint of Hotspot, who originally debuted in Combiner Wars and then was reused yet again for Pyramagna for the Victorion. We have just Inferno in his standard red and black fire truck mode. He's even got the crane. And because of how the torso mode goes, the torso for the Combiner ends up being a lot of black and gray as opposed to a lot of the red. So we get some very unique modes because of how this figure transforms. Here is Inferno, and let me tell you, he's very thin. He's very thin. If we turn him to the side, you can see that his body is very, very thin, and he has a very large backpack due to the ladder. It's not necessarily a bad thing. The ladder does provide essentially kind of a third leg to help, or heels, I guess, to help him balance. Especially because when you lean the ladder back, well, he can still stand. It's just a little less stable. I want to get a zoom in on that head sculpt, just so you can see. It's a pretty nice head sculpt. He does have a pretty generic expression, which is a kind of a bummer, but oh well. As you may notice, he doesn't have any of his accessories on him. That's because there's really weird ways of attaching them. So, Inferno comes with these two rifles. These two rifles, which are actually pretty nicely molded. And they are mirrors of each other. They unfortunately cannot connect together into one solid rifle, which is a little bit of a bummer. But something that is interesting is they're designed to combine with the Prime armor. Kind of. The Prime armor, as you can see, isn't the gun armor that we got with Hunger, but actually it's a remold of the Starscream Alita 1 armor, but in all black. So that's interesting that it shows a different armor on the box. So there are actually two ways that they recommend attaching these, but just for the reference, here is Inferno with both of his, I don't know, for lack of a better term, water rifles? I don't know. There he is. Looks pretty good. I like the guns. They're nice. I think this looks pretty silly. This is definitely not necessary. The other way, though, is to plug, again, this bit. Actually, no. It's to plug the ankle bit into the back of Inferno's shoulder on these little holes, these little 5mm pegs. And then, on top of that, have the fire extinguisher, the water cannon. You can either have it pointing straight up like that, or you can turn it on its side and plug it in like that. Now, personally, I like it sitting up. I think it's a little bit more of a secure connection. But look at that. You can either have these over-the-shoulder water cannons, or you can have an oversized blaster. I don't personally like the way this looks. The shoulder looks okay. One also downside is that because the hips are on ratchets, it doesn't stand fluidly. Collector card displaying the same Inferno artwork. Looks good. In my case, I have Micronus Inferno, combining with, of course, Micronus Prime, the first minicon, the prime of minicons. And it says, power links to share his resistance to extreme heat, which is pretty cool. I like that. Speaking of power linking, Inferno's combined form doesn't actually have a name. unlike Alita, who had Alita 1, whose combiner form takes the name Alita Infinite, and Starscream, who I think is just King Starscream, and of course Grimlock, who is a Volcanicus. Inferno's is literally just called the Inferno Combiner. There is no official canon name for his combiner, which is a little disappointing, just a little bit. But he also does come, of course, with the Autobot Enigma. His is kind of a smoky blue. For comparison, here he is with Alita 1, my kind of standard for Voyagers nowadays. You can see roughly the same height. Here he is with Chrome Dome, my standard for deluxe classes, and you can see he definitely scales well. Here he is with Voyager Hound from The Last Knight. I know it may seem a little odd to compare him to Hound, but just because he's also a transport truck, also a Voyager, who also dual wields these big bad rifles. And then last but not least, I thought this would be kind of a fun treat. You may have seen this figure from one of my first videos, but here he is from the Armada. Here is Overload. Overload is kind of a mid-grade between. He's an ultra class, which unlike the ultra classes from Cyberverse, which are basically kind of the Voyager, the ultra class in Armada, just like with Jetfire and of course the Optimus Prime mold, was basically slightly larger than a Voyager, but smaller than a Leader. And he turns into a fire truck and was also originally red with yellow highlights, as opposed to now where he is yellow with burgundy highlights. I got a repaint. Here is Inferno in his fire truck mode. You can see that basically you just pancake the figure and then attach the fire hoses, cannons on the side. I think it looks pretty good. You definitely can lift and lower the and rotate the ladder thing here. Since the bucket itself does have a little canister and a little spray nozzle, I don't know how well that shows up on camera, but you can see it. There are some details up here, though not a lot. But yeah, I kind of like the idea of pegging it in to the I guess you could call it a rescue bucket, like that, to make this kind of like a rotating turret of sorts. And as you see, it can pose a little bit. Honestly, I think this looks a little bit better, don't you? I think this looks a little bit better. One thing I will say that's bad about this figure is not only does this figure have visible hands syndrome in the back, but has not one case of visible head syndrome, but two. You have the combiner head clearly visible here, and you can easily, with one finger, flip it up to see the combiner head in there, which, that's kind of bad. I'll admit, that's kind of bad. Double visible head syndrome is not something that should be applauded. But, I mean, hey, I'll give him the credit where credit is due of coming up with a combiner that works, or coming up with a fire truck that actually looks really good. Yeah, so this is how the instructions say to attach the Prime Armor. Not only does this look completely stupid, but it also just doesn't make any sense. I was being redundant on purpose. If you remember, we had something similar when we did Broadside, who is essentially just him pancaked out and forming a plank. That's kind of what we have to do with Inferno. He's basically just a plank with wheels and a cool ladder that's on his backpack. Because literally, if we take this ladder piece off, he's basically just a plank with wheels. And then for comparison, since we compared him to some other truck formers earlier, here is Autobot Hound from The Last Knight. You can see he definitely doesn't have as much length as Inferno, but he makes up for it by being a lot more bulky. And just for fun, for another big fire truck, here he is with Overload. And you can see that Overload is actually just about the same size, or just about the same, you can see Overload is just about the same length. And he's got the whole red with yellow, yellow with red. He's got cannons above him. Overall, this Inferno figure is a pretty good mold. I will admit, I wish it had a little more posability in the legs, but, you know, I guess that's what you gotta do considering this is a combiner torso. And would you look at that, Inferno actually has a really nice torso mode. Like I said, the basket ladder thing opens up to form a chest plate, which I actually really like the look of this chest plate, and it adds a whole lot of white and silver to Inferno. You can see it's basically just Inferno doing a half transformed and then with his arms folded in, but you can see the ladder completely wraps down his chest and back up his torso to pop out this little head. And one thing that I think is kind of cool about this head is, I don't know if it'll show up on camera, but if you take a look, the cheeks have this kind of like battle damage molding underneath, like between the nose and the helmet. It may not show very well. But to me, that kind of gives the idea that maybe he's got some physical damage that we just can't see, or since he's a firefighter, maybe some mental damage, like aka some mental scarring or something. I don't know, I just kind of like that idea. Seems kind of neat. And unfortunately, there isn't any way to attach the Prime Master to the chest, since this wasn't remolded. But you could potentially try to plug it in, I don't know, somewhere. Like, you could try to, like, I don't know, if you really wanted to, you could always, like, glue it or something. You know, like, give him a little, like, crotch crystal. Or something like that. Oops. It looks really good. There's not even any attachment point here, though, as you can see, you can technically slot it into the back in addition to some other Combiner Wars stuff. So I guess you could potentially put it on the back, though it's not designed to go there. I guess since we're throwing Dinobot limbs on him, here he is compared to the Grimlock Volcanicus torso. Right, here is Inferno with some Combiner limbs. He's got all 4 Dinobots. And honestly, this looks really good. The silver on his torso matches the silver on the Dinobot, so I think this is actually a really nice looking combined form. And obviously I gave him the Inferno rifles as opposed to the little tiny Dinobot daggers. Yeah, I think this looks pretty good. Obviously though, I would not want this as my primary combiner. I'd much rather have the Volcanicus torso. But thank you all for watching. Until next time, I'm Metagross Freak with Power of the Primes Inferno.